Hi, Matt.
Hey Graham, good to see you.
Nice to see you. This is the Crazy in Love podcast where two psychotherapists talk about all things about modern relationships. Tonight, Matt, we are going to do a little bit of a look at a recent novel, Miranda July's All Fours, but mainly to just tease out some of the themes that have come out of the cultural commentary, particularly around kind of women in unfulfilling marriages and sexual freedom in midlife
Yeah.
and beyond. Just to start that conversation, what were the themes out of the book or in that cultural commentary that really you wanted to unpick tonight?
Yeah, it's an interesting book, isn't it? I think it's a fun setup and premise that she's gonna sort of accidentally leave her husband and child to explore her don't know what you'd call it, almost I think she would say maybe burgeoning sexuality, in
Yeah.
that kind of moment. And I suppose the theme for us would be something along the lines of, is the grass always green? Is that a wise thing to do? She almost feels compelled. It's like she's being sort of driven by a motor or something to do it. I think that's some of the sense of the book, that there's almost no choice in this. I sometimes hear people say to me in the therapy hour something like, I fell in love, as if, I don't know, you fell, you were pulled, you could do nothing about it. But I often think, well, you've made a series of choices. You've had those long lingering conversations, you've gone for coffee, you've put yourself in the way of that thing. Those are really
Mm.
choice points. And I suppose that was the thing for me, that sense that she was being I don't know, it was a compelling force. And I think I'd want to slow that story down if it was being told to me in therapy and say, hang on, there's a greater degree of choice here than is being supposed.
Well, let's slow down a little bit.
Mm.
Let's one of the themes that seem to really resonate from the book, particularly with the kind of female columnists that I read, what was this really quite resonating image of a woman in quite a stifling, quite traditional marriage, and how boring that life seemed
Yeah,
in,
yeah,
in the novel, and how the life when she is, just for those who haven't read the book, the protagonist goes on a road trip um, to leave her child and her husband, but halfway between, I think it's from New York to LA,
yeah,
and
sure.
pretty soon after she leaves, the home ends up in a hotel room and
She's
starts.
about 30 minutes from home, isn't she? So the road trip
Yeah,
almost never begins.
almost never begins. She
I
just
think she stops for gas or something,
yeah.
and sees a guy, and then
He's a
sees.
guy falls head over heels for him in Lust to begin with. So it's a very horny book. It's a very kind of
Yeah,
sexually open book. It's
yeah,
very
yeah, yeah.
much about her physical and emotional independence away from her traditional family structure.
That bit's quite well done, isn't it? I think that bit it drew me in a bit. Like, it kept me reading for a while because it was those things that you describe it to be. But it also seemed, even at that stage, to me, I don't know whether I sort of lack imagination in this respect, but it seemed implausible,
Uh,
because it didn't seem that dusty and boring, the relationship, actually.
No, it's interesting, isn't it? And the sex she was having with her husband, although it seemed perfunctory at times, seemed also quite fulfilling in the sense that she was orgasming regularly, etc. So it wasn't like
Yeah.
she was having a completely dry, sexless relationship and detested her husband physically.
No, and
It
he
was just that sense
wasn't
of
was
stifling
wasn't
boredom.
yeah, he wasn't terribly boorish. She didn't paint him as a
No,
tiresome guy. He
no.
looked like, I don't know what the sort of household division of labor looked like, but he was doing comfortably more than, a negligible percentage of that. It looked like a fairly okay relationship. And that bit just felt a bit unmotivated, not really to do literary criticism, but more, why would you leave in those circumstances? I never quite got why you'd leave and why you would feel so lustful towards this kind of random, that bit, or even if you did, why you'd take an action on it.
Yes.
Very enthralled to the feelings. This is the thing I find in therapy a lot. People have got a very big feeling, and it's like, okay, you've got a very big feeling. I think I understand that. I get big feelings too, but it doesn't really mean if you're furiously angry, you're going to act that out with aggression towards somebody. And if you're feeling incredibly lustful to somebody, it similarly doesn't mean you're going to act that out, or you have to act that out, or it will do anything to you. It will hurt you. It will cause you to have, um, a heart attack, an ulcer. You'll be fine with that feeling. You'll be able to process that. You are having a feeling. It's worth thinking about and wondering about, but it doesn't lead you necessarily directly to a course of action.
I guess part of what is so interesting for a lot of people, I guess, particularly for a lot of women, and I know there's an irony in two guys talking about the book and the themes in it, but we're going to have to run with that, aren't we?
Yeah, sure.
I think
Yeah.
part of it is the idea of a lack of choice even within that structure that you're talking about. So the idea that one's feelings are even important or considered or responded to in those traditional relationships, it is anathema. That the book is paints a portrait of someone who is responding from more fundamental, possibly primal desires for sex, for independence, for control over their own lives. And I can understand why that does resonate with a lot of women, that idea of no regrets. I'm not going to regret this decision. So it's interesting where you went with that part of the conversation, almost like you were imagining talking to that person in therapy, having regretted having an affair. But it doesn't feel like there's any regrets in the novel. This is very much about, this is her passionate self finding fulfillment in the world with no regrets. And I think that might be part of what really resonates with a lot of the readers, and with a lot of our clients. Just bringing it back to the therapy room, is that fantasy, and maybe we can explore the kind of difference between the fantasy and reality. The fantasy of just going, you know what, I don't like this life, don't like this relationship, I'm out. I'm going to put myself first.
I agree. I think you've summarized it well there. She also talks about beauty, doesn't she, and sort of following the aesthetic life. So part of one of the sort of weirdnesses of the book is she takes the hotel room and then has it expensively redecorated in a very lavish style. So it's a very beautiful room within I think a bog standard motel, right?
Yeah.
And her friend is sort of, I can't remember terribly well, but perhaps something to do with the art world or something along those lines. He's a follower of beauty, and he's very supportive of this relationship because she's taken a step into kind of following that, that kind of wonder and gloriousness and this sort of aesthetic, beautiful life. It was a bit of follow your bliss, wasn't it, in there, I thought as well. It seemed to me, those points, they seemed quite childish and silly and dangerous in the way that children can be like wonderful, inventive, playful, and can delight you with the way their minds work. And they can also be a danger to themselves. They can be foolish and silly. They can make perfectly ridiculous choices, and that's why as parents typically we make many of those choices for them: how they cross a road, where they cross a road, what kind of food groups are on their plate, what time they go to bed. Children would not make good choices for themselves. It felt like she'd sort of let all of that, I don't know, all of what tethers us go. And some of what tethers us is helpful, necessary.
Say a bit more about that. What would you counter is helpful in the more traditional life, then, that she is the protagonist of this novel is seeking to escape, is pushing against? What is helpful there?
I didn't really know. I mean, maybe you're better to answer this. I didn't really know what she was pushing against because I couldn't quite see the problem that she was trying to solve. The risk, I think, the way I would come at it, maybe for her, is she is in love with the child that within their
family.
Yeah, so she adores the child and she paints the child in like a very vivid way. It's a bit too much for me. It's a bit sort of sickly, but that, I think, the choices she's making and the effect on that child would be something I would draw out. Like, this is not going to be a better life
Right.
for
So,
that.
so, so, so one aspect of those decisions is the absence of consideration of other people. Now, within that dynamic, so not really thinking about the husband, not really thinking about the child, not really thinking too much about the people that she's sleeping with either and their feelings
Sure.
involved.
Yeah.
Now, the pushback would be, well, I've spent my life as a woman having to think about the considerations of other people. I've had to think about
Yeah.
the feelings of men in my life, particularly, and prioritize the
Yeah.
feelings of men. And I'm sick of doing it, and I
Yeah.
want a
Yeah.
break
Yeah.
from doing that.
Yeah, it's a good counter. I think that's really helpful for you to put it that way. Except I think what she's doing partly is she's ruining her own experience of that life as well. So I think she has the way the child is drawn, like she is deeply involved in that child's life. Like she knows all about the child, and it's painted in a in a really vivid way. But then there is this absence, and then when she comes home and she's full of longing for the lover that she's met, she is not present in that child's life, and it becomes burdensome to look after them. So one, I think there is an implication for the child and for family life, but two, I think she sort of ruined her own fun. It just doesn't look like a smart choice for me in the round for her. If we just put it through her lens, through the woman's lens in that situation, I'm not sure she's created more beauty or wonder. I think she's created deep distress for herself. And I actually couldn't get through the book. I found it just a bit insufferable. And I wondered how it ended, whether she came to a realization or whether she really felt like downcast about it, because the point at which I dropped off reading it, she was really in turmoil and she created like complete unhappiness and distress for herself. It was not
Mm.
thing nor the other. She hadn't gone into a new relationship. She hadn't really reconciled with bringing another into her existing family setup. And she was deeply miserable and guilt ridden in the family home. And I would have said, if it was a session of therapy, like I would wonder with her what it is she's achieved.
Yeah, and the one of the themes for me that didn't necessarily come out of the book, but was a theme I was thinking about after reading it was, and I think about this with a lot of the work that we do in the therapy room, is the impossibility of life's at either extreme. That life is a sequence of trade-offs and trying to balance those extreme positions in life. So whether you look at kind of personal fulfillment versus wider family relationships, for example, or if you look at the poles of independence and dependence, or if you look at personal achievement versus collective achievement, whatever it might be, or even just individual freedom versus tying yourself down in certain ways, that there's a sequence of poles in life, or a sequence of different opposites, that a
Yeah.
life well lived fundamentally is about trying to keep them pretty well balanced first
Yeah.
off, but then second, probably more importantly, accepting the impossibility of finding the right balance. that
Yeah. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
there's always going to be parts of your life or parts of yourself that feel unfulfilled, and what you do with those tensions and
Yeah.
the decisions you make from those tensions ultimately defines your life, right, in
Yeah,
terms of
I thought
mistakes that you make.
trade-offs was a really helpful way of saying it, and I think it's probably why you and I should never try and do any creative writing or write a novel, right? Because it would just be about, well, there are trade-offs, right?
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
it would be something
There
along
is
those.
no right answer. Yeah.
I guess she's pushing, for us to find a way for us to think about something else. But I sort of admire that. It was an interesting kind of thought experiment. But it just seemed to me to be, well, this is patently a bad idea. This is why there is a notion of trade-offs, right? And why you've got to take that seriously, and why a good life reckons with that rather than trying to ignore it. Because I think, to be repetitive, I think she created, an unhappy position for herself, child, and for the would-be lover, and for her husband. I think they were married, but her, the
Yeah.
partner
Yeah, they
was
were.
father of the child.
Yeah. But the cultural commentator Fred Bull, one of his
Yeah.
is kind of questions about the book and about the commentary following the book's publication was where does this lead in terms of your life if at midlife you're making these sequence of passion based decisions to rip your life up at
Yeah.
45, that can feel quite compelling and can lead to some quite drastic life changes and life decisions.
Yeah.
But in doing so, you have to have one eye on being 65. You have to have another eye on
Yeah,
being
right. Yeah,
85.
that was interesting.
It's not just about the next few months and getting your rocks off and feeling liberated in a lot of ways in your life, that will run out pretty quick. That anyone who's got too much time on their hands knows that actually having too much time in your hands and too much of a good thing actually does get tiresome pretty quickly, and you need to then start building something new that is going to be there in 20 years time.
It's true of so much else, isn't it? That sort of short-term, longer-term needs reasoning. It always makes me think of the gym and exercise, which may not be particularly enjoyable in the moment, but it's a way of ensuring greater strength and flexibility and better bone density and muscle mass and all the things that will enable you to then recover from injury or setback or an operation or whatever else. It's a bit like money, money spent today will be gone, money saved today will compound and will grow over time. It's those sorts of things. I mean, it'd be a very boring novel if it said something along those lines, but it seemed to me as
Yeah,
reading it,
yeah,
this is just so far off the pace in terms of a good idea. This is such a bad idea. It felt almost sort of pathological to me. It felt like people who are addicted to love or addicted to sex sometimes, like this is not a good thing to be. There's a strong compulsion, just like for some people who feel a compulsion around drugs or alcohol, but this is not a good idea for people who have that compulsion to live that life to its fullest. Doesn't end well.
yeah, I agree. I think part of the fun of the novel is that she's doing that from a female perspective, right? She's doing
Mm.
some of the great literature that I've loved over the years, something like Updike, or Saul Bellow or someone like that endless novels about selfish men
And yeah,
choosing to rip up a family and a life for their own kind of sex interests or their own financial interest, or whatever it is. That you're supposed to sympathize with these men, and they do a wonderful job of helping you to do that. And part of the joy of this novel is that ultimately I wasn't an enormous fan of where it went, but the joy of reading that protagonist and having someone from that perspective, that female perspective, say, I'm going to be selfish and I'm going to do what I want for a while. There's something quite powerful in that.
yeah, and I think those early pages of the description of what she was doing, just how sort of mad it was like it was also fun. You did go along with the ride, like it did
Yeah,
carry along for
yeah,
a
yeah,
certain
yeah.
degree of time. I agree with you. I think it's really smart to point out Updike and others, but I mean that I read that relatively recently. I think Rabbit is Rich.
Rabbit, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
and he's not rich, it's
Yeah,
like
yeah. No, he's a pathetic character, actually, isn't he? Yeah,
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 yeah. And I think you're right in some of that, but part of the displeasure or the problem in reading those things now is I'm reading them from sort of clinical perspective and thinking, does this make for a good life? Like, what would we say about this? Like, who else is implicated in this story? And it just never looks, it never looks like that good an idea. And all of those choices that he made earlier on in his life are coming back to haunt him a bit
mm-hmm.
at that
Mm-hmm.
point.
Yeah,
And there's an irony in that title. I mean, he is materially rich at that point. He
absolutely.
was materially rich through he didn't actually get he didn't generate the wealth. He inherited it through his wife, and that rankles with him. So the whole thing is sort of shot through with
Yeah.
serious less than brilliant decisions or ways life's turned for him.
So how would we help the protagonist in All Fours, or the couple that come to see us? You've got two individuals, midlife, one who might be going through the menopause, who's having all sorts of big feelings and not knowing what to do with those feelings. We obviously wouldn't want to be trite, and we wouldn't want to be flippant and say, well, like you were doing earlier, well, everyone has big feelings, just suck it up. You're not advocating that, and I didn't take you to mean that, but there is something about sitting with those feelings long enough to be comfortable with them and comfortable to know what direction they're pointing you in.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to be flippant about those things, but I am sort of saying that. I'm definitely saying that in my own life. I have had big feelings over the years, still sometimes have them as well. And I don't need to do anything with them. Like, the early part of your question was sort of what you do with those feelings. My answer, truthfully, is nothing. They'll
Mm.
go. Then they're not so riveting, they're not so interesting, and that was why the novel didn't really interest
I'm
me.
not sure. I'm not sure I take quite such a blanket approach. So
No, I think
we're going back to those idea of tensions that
yeah.
if one member of a couple is feeling like their life is too boring, their life isn't dynamic enough, that they've got the house and the kids, but they go to the office every day, but that's not enough for them. The risk is that they respond to that with something big, like just blowing the whole thing up,
That's
rather
all I
than
mean. I
finding a
think
way to make their life just that little bit more dynamic and exciting, so
I
that
think that's the common ground between us there. So I would say you don't need to do anything dramatic with that feeling. You don't need to act that out in some new or novel or dangerous way, but you do need to use it as intel. Like if that is coming back at you over the course of weeks and months, like it's telling you something, isn't it? Like we're running a risk here. I'm fundamentally unsatisfied, but rather than take a dramatic action with somebody else in the example you're painting, if you're in a relationship, I would at least turn in and have a go, maybe through couples counseling, maybe on your own if you can manage it, to say, do you know what, this ain't working for me, this is fundamentally unsatisfying, I'm utterly bored with our sex life at the moment, or we never see one another, or we're rushing around so much and it's just a succession of handing the baton over for the kids, or all we seem to do is pay bills, and that stuff is worth talking about, right? So I would use that intel to do something. I just wouldn't do again, it would be anger for me. It's like there would be an angry feeling. You might have been shortchanged, in a service interaction, or you might have been overlooked consistently at your place of work. You're not going to go in and, I don't know, cuss the place out or get into a fist fight with somebody, but you are probably going to say, having thought about what you want, marshaled your evidence, that I feel poorly treated in this situation, and I would like some form of redress, or I'd like to bring that to your attention, or I'm going
yeah.
to take my time and apply it elsewhere. It would be those sorts of things. So I wouldn't do nothing with it. I wouldn't do the dramatic thing. Like you don't need to send that ill-advised email, or you know
Yeah, you don't need to walk away from a relationship with a man if you feel like you're having to take care of his feelings too much. That can be a topic that you can
yeah.
confront with him, ideally,
Yeah,
within a.
yeah, yeah. I think that's a really nice way of putting it. I mean, it's a bit humdrum, but I think that would be really important. And I think in the relationship she's in the book, it would even be useful. Like, I'd be really surprised if the male character isn't really painted that sharp.
Yeah,
If that wouldn't get met and understood, or she might ask him to toughen up a bit because he seems a bit limp sometimes.
yeah, yeah.
He's letting her go off on the road trip. He doesn't really ask sufficient questions to know that she hasn't been on a road trip. She's been like camped out half an hour down the road,
Yeah,
having
indeed. Yeah,
hot.
that's a good point. Yeah,
Like, is he really, is he tuned into it? So she might feel a bit unattended to, a bit
yeah,
unloved, a bit unnoticed, and her dissatisfaction hasn't even caused a ripple. That could be part of the problem, couldn't it? But I'd ever go at speaking about that rather than, picking up a sexual relationship with somebody who's like considerably younger than her in this instance, and with whom she doesn't really even believe it's going to go anywhere, and to some extent doesn't want it to go anywhere. I think
yeah,
she's put herself in a knot, rather than deal with the much more, I would say the much more difficult thing is like, oh, what do we do about our relationship and the fact that it's gone south, or it's no longer as interesting or vital as it once was? How do we rebuild that? Can we, are we willing to even have a conversation about that, knowing that we might not be able to get it back on tracks, and it might be really different from how it once was?
yeah. Nice.
I
Nice.
think there's a big bit of fantasy there. I was just going to, maybe this is the final point, but I was thinking about the media's obsession with like rough sex and choking and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
And it's like ripped through the media. I was just like swapping a text with a friend this week, and I don't hear about it. Like, I don't hear about that desire in client work. And I talk a lot about relationships with clients, and we get into the detail quite often of their sex lives. And that comes up so infrequently. It feels like a media obsession, and it feels like fantasy land rather than in reality. So the survey data on that suggests that quite a lot of people, women included, have and do fantasize about rough sex, but those who've actually had that as a consistent part of their relationship, far fewer. So the numbers are like sort of 50% for the people who fantasized about it, and something like 5 and 3% for the people who actually have that kind of dominance as a part of their actual sex life. And the novel and the wanting to escape felt more like a fantasy and a thing you might want to do, that prompting you, or I don't know, giving you intel to do something, but not that thing. That make any sense?
It makes a lot of sense. I like the idea of almost seeing it as a fantasy that might come across being a bit flippant and being a bit dismissive of it. But I think in the best sense,
in the best sense, yeah,
it was a fantasy novel in that way. Yeah. And where those fantasies can lead. And I think we're just trying to bring in a little tinge of realism off the back of it. Which was spoil sport, exactly. Conservatives coming in with their ideas of relationships being the answer to all of life's questions. Yeah, good. All right. So thumbs down from Matt, a kind of thumb sideways from me, maybe.
Yeah.
All right.
Good to talk.
Yeah. As ever, we're at Crazy in Love Podcast UK at gmail.com if you'd like to drop us a line. We'll see you soon. Take care.